I'm Dan Graboy, and this is Life in Time of Pandemic. Today, I am talking with one of my oldest colleagues and a very old friend, Jon Nelson, my colleague in Meridian Arts Ensemble. Hi, Jon.
Hi, Dan. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm pretty good. Thank you.
So just so people know, you're a trumpet player, you're a composer, you're an arranger, you're a recording engineer and editor now. You have many hats that you wear, and you're a professor at Buffalo, the SUNY campus at Buffalo. And looks like you're speaking with me from your office at school.
Yes, I've been cleaning my office because before COVID, this doubled as a rehearsal room. I'd have brass quintet coachings in here, and at one point we had a 14-piece band in here with drum set and electric guitars and things like that. So that's probably not going to happen in this small space now. So I'm arranging the office so that we can still have lessons and be socially distant.
So that people know who may be watching this at some unspecified point in the future, we are having this conversation on the 8th of July, 2020. So we're deep into the summer. At many campuses, we're deep into uncertainty about the fall semester. COVID is really having a huge impact on our world now. Tell me what's happening at Buffalo.
We just got word that we'll have to be socially distancing in our ensembles. My band will continue as it has been. They'll be capping the registration to 45 students. And the sizes of the ensembles will be based on the size of the room. So we have a big rehearsal room. I know that they've gotten 100 people in there in the past. So I'll be able to have my band at its usual time on Monday, Wednesday afternoon with 45 players. And we will probably be 8 to 10 feet apart. And I will be purchasing a product that is made by the company called Stretchable Covers. You've seen marching bands with sousaphones that have the band logo or the college logo on it. That's a stretchable cover. Excuse me, it doesn't affect the sound. And it has been discovered that this will prevent droplets from traveling past the bell. So I'm purchasing these covers for clarinets, saxophones, trumpets, trombones, and tubas. Horn and flute is a little different. I think I'm probably just going to put the French horns in the back so that their droplets go to the wall, because you can't really play the horn if your hand isn't in it. And I recently heard about a product for flute. It's a small plexiglass attachment that goes on the flute that covers the mouth, that prevents any droplets from traveling past that point. So I think we should be able to still continue to have our ensembles, and we may have to take students' temperature before they enter the room. So they'll be, setting up, cleaning up, possibly taking temperatures. If you don't have your cover, you can't play, those kinds of things. And then my other class, the Frank Zappa Media Bias class, we will have in a large room. That class will be in person. Will be capped at 28 students. And I'll still be able to teach the class using video and audio and these kinds of things. So my life hasn't changed that much from the standpoint of my teaching. We're a small music department, so it's manageable. Some schools, the schools of music that have maybe 2 orchestras and 3 or 4 or 5 bands that have been squeezed for space, it's going to be more challenging, I think, for those larger institutions. But we were able to kind of move forward as we have been. So I'm happy about that.
That's great. Of course, one big concern is the group that comes into a room after your orchestra or band has been in there for a while. And these are problems that every school of music and department of music is going to have to cope with going forward.
Yeah, Dr. Fauci was saying last night that these droplets can get into an HVAC system and they can live in there and exist and then be pushed back out. So really outside is the best, but we can't really do that in Madison or Buffalo after November.
Right. And as you talk, I'm listening to the air pumping into my electronic music lab from where I'm talking to you and thinking, I'm glad nobody uses this building right now.
Yeah, it's a good time for me to be over here. It's pretty much empty, so I can get a lot of work done, prepare for the fall.
Yes. So before we talk more about the future, let's talk about the past. You are one of the founders of Meridian Arts Ensemble, which is a brass quintet, sometimes with drums. You put that together with friends in 1987, and I came on board a year plus later in the early 1989, and that group is still going. Tell me about your early history. Why did you want to put the group together? Where did you grow up? Give us some background.
I grew up in Middleborough, Massachusetts, which is about 45 miles southeast of Boston. Both of my parents were music educators. I grew up playing in the band and the orchestra and jazz bands. I started playing the trumpet in the 4th grade. I think I started playing piano in the 1st grade. In the 7th grade, I started to study percussion and became very interested in that. And in the 9th grade, I studied the double bass through high school because my folks believed that it was best to try to explore each family, strings, percussion, winds, and keyboard to just broaden my knowledge. It was pretty evident for me, probably in the 7th or 8th grade, that I wanted to go into music as a career because I really wasn't happy doing much else. So they helped me prepare for that.
Are you glad that you took all those different instruments? Do you agree with their philosophy?
Yes, and that's actually a European model that was very common in the 19th century and still really today, that if you're going to be, for example, a composer, you also need to conduct and you need to be able to play a couple of instruments. If you're going to be a conductor, you definitely need to be able to play some instruments and are likely some kind of scholar. So it's really about being well prepared, I think, and exposing yourself to as much information as possible. Not to become expert in those things, because that's not really possible for most people, but to gain knowledge from what the world of music is all about.
And you went on to get your undergraduate degree at Juilliard. And for non-musicians who may be watching this interview, what's that like? And what was your experience like at Juilliard?
Well, I went to Juilliard when I was 17 and a half, and I just happened to have a good day at the auditions. I was not of virtuoso level or of a very high caliber as a trumpet player, but I had a good day and I got in, so I went. And I had this idea that I would like to play in a symphony orchestra. And I had played in youth orchestra in high school and youth wind ensemble. And I loved the music, frankly. The music's great. I used to listen to a lot of Strauss and Wagner and Bruckner and Mahler as a high school student. I remember I got a cassette of the Boston Symphony playing Ein Heldenleben with Eric Leinsdorf from the early 60s. And the playing was unbelievable. The energy was just frightening. And I was really intrigued by that kind of, just performance energy, even on a recording. So I got to school, and there were two things that I couldn't really get my head around. One was you have to count a lot of rests when you play in an orchestra. Well, I guess there were three things. The second thing was it's really about the competition. You can't really make too much of an artistic statement in the orchestra because, let's face it, if we have 90 people making their most profound artistic statement every note that they play, it could be chaotic. It could be interesting, but it could be chaotic. And the third was we worked with a lot of student conductors, and it became apparent to me that a lot of the musicians around me, even as students, knew the pieces better than the conductors. And this is something that I experienced in my professional life, that, a lot of conductors just really don't know the music as well as the players, because the players have spent thousands of hours developing their craft and studying the repertoire. And also the conductor makes no sound. They get paid more, and they walk out on stage and get the solo bow, and they get their face on the cover of the record jacket, but they make no sound, and they don't necessarily really have to know the piece. Often the orchestra can just play the piece with a minimal amount of guidance from the conductor. So that was kind of a turnoff. So I had to reconcile that, and I decided that I wasn't going to wait around for 75 measures rest to play my big 2-5-1 entrance, and we started the group.
So before we talk about Meridian, let's just dig into those the three beefs that you had with your orchestra playing in a little more depth. So you talked about counting rests. So for people who aren't musicians and haven't played in an ensemble, what do you mean counting rests? Why are you counting rests? Why aren't you playing? What's going on with that?
Yeah, the history of the orchestra started with small string ensembles, and then it was expanded using flutes, clarinets, bassoons, horns. Then the brass came later, and the brass were written into the orchestrations as a means of supporting the sound that the strings made. So the tuba was the metal version of the double bass, the trombone being the metal version of the cello, the French horn being the metal version of the viola, and the trumpet, the metal version of the violin. So usually if you watch any symphony orchestra, you'll notice that the strings and the winds are playing almost all the time. And they complain about that. You talk to any orchestral string player, and they are unhappy that the second chair viola is playing the whole show, and the third trumpet might just play for a total of 15 minutes in the piece, but they get paid the same. I prefer to just be playing. If I'm not playing, I tend to get into trouble. Bored, cracking jokes, goofing off, reading a book, getting lost in my book.
And we've done plenty of that together in orchestra rehearsals.
Right. So that was, I just didn't really, so the rests as a trumpet player, you got to sit around. I think trombone players have it worse. They really sit around. I think in Mahler Third Symphony, the bass trombone doesn't play till like the last movement or something. You got to sit on stage for like an hour, and then you play. I mean, it's wonderful what you play. Percussion players have that too. At the end of the Bruckner Fifth Symphony, there's one cymbal crash at the very end of the last movement. They gotta hire a guy or a woman, and they gotta sit there and wait. And you better come in the proper place with that cymbal crash, because if you don't, you're going to be pushing a shopping cart full of cans trying to get 5-cent deposit.
So your second point that you made was about artistry within the orchestra. And I think this may have been a point that surprises people, which is why I definitely want to come back to it. So I think most people know at this point that there are auditions for orchestral positions. It's very hard to win these auditions. And orchestras are filled with virtuoso players. They're incredible. And you talked about that with the Boston Symphony in the 1960s. And the Boston Symphony continues to have just magnificent players, probably 90 or 100 of them. And yet you're saying that orchestra playing is not necessarily such a feat of artistry as people might think. So can you unpack that a little for us?
I think the conservatories and the universities have been lying to everybody for a long time, telling the students that you are artists and then grinding them out into symphony orchestras. We are not artists, we are artisans. We are curators. The artist is the composer who created the work, put it on paper. When it's on the stand, we are curating that artwork. It's an artisanal activity. If you were truly going to be an artist in the orchestra, you would make up your own version of what's in front of you, kind of like Mozart improvising a cadenza, right? So I think that's a distinction that higher education has been very sneaky about, kind of sliding that one by everybody. You know, you talk to Juilliard students and graduates of these schools and they say, well, I'm an artist. Well, not really.
Well, if you're an actor,
you're playing something that's already been written down, you know, you're curating. And that's fine. There's no shame in curation. We need curators, but it's not artistry.
If you are an actor and you're playing Hamlet, you are beholden to the text that Shakespeare wrote, but presumably you have a fair amount of leeway in creating the character of Hamlet based on not only how you deliver the text, how you say the sentences that Shakespeare wrote, but your facial expressions, the way you hold your body, the way you interact with other characters within the play, the set design of the play. I mean, there is interpretive room. How would you compare the role of, say, a second trumpet player in an orchestra, not the principal, to that?
To the actor?
Yes.
Well, the role of the second trumpet player in the orchestra is to support the first trumpet player, period. Your job is to make the first trumpet player sound good all the time, no matter what. If he or she is having a bad day, the second trumpet player has to make the first player sound great all the time. Okay, and that's a hard skill. That's a very sort of, you know, I mean, it's a question of functionality. You know, your role is very specific in that chair. Now, you can approach your curatorship with artistic ideals, such as the museum curator. Where do they hang the work? What else is in the same room where the work is hung? What color are the walls in the gallery? How high are the ceilings? How many people are going to be allowed into a particular place to view? If it's too crowded, we can't appreciate the artwork, right? The curator has to set up the conditions so that the artwork can be appreciated, viewed, and digested by the public. I think classical music, it's the same thing.
Compare now the artistic leeway, to create a term for this, that the first trumpet player, the principal trumpet player, might have. He or she has a second trumpet player doing a lot of work to make the first trumpet job easier. And I think people don't realize probably what's going on in this very interesting orchestral dynamic that you're describing. But presumably the first trumpet player has a little more opportunity to create a personal voice, or no?
I think to a point. So that Einheldenleben recording that I mentioned, there are two very important trumpet players on that recording, Armando Guitarra and Roger Voisin. Roger Voisin was the principal trumpet in the Boston Symphony from about 1950 to 65 or so, 67. While he was first trumpet, Charles Munch, the French conductor, was the director of the Boston Symphony. And he loved the unique personality of Roger Voisin's sound. Some years later, Armando Guitarra was hired as the third trumpet, an assistant principal. When Charles Munch retired, the German conductor Erich Leinsdorf was hired and came in, and immediately his comment was, Roger Voisin's sound sticks out too much. I don't want to hear that trumpet sound. And he had Armando Guitarra and Roger Voisin switch positions. So then Roger Voisin went to third trumpet and Armando Guitarra went to first trumpet. So even, that's 60 years ago. A conductor came in and said, that's not the sound that's in my head. I don't like it. And he made a change. If we fast forward to where we are now, I think it's very unlikely that a trumpet player is going to win a job in an orchestra unless it is in line with the sound that the conductor has in his or her head. Again, let's reiterate, conductors do not make sound. They have a sound in their head that they're imagining is the ideal sound for any instrument, and that's what they want. In the old days, well, not that long ago, in the 50s and 60s, the orchestras were not yet multi-tracking recordings, and they were not editing like they do now. It was often just a few microphones on stage capturing the sound of the orchestra, right? Now, you can edit anything, and you can make anything sound good. And you can make anything sound like you want it to. So what has happened with classical recordings, probably since the 70s or so, 80s really, it all sounds the same. You used to be able to tell the difference between the Philadelphia Orchestra and the Boston Symphony and the Chicago and the Cleveland. Not anymore. Maybe if you're somewhat knowledgeable about those orchestras, but to the average listener, there's no distinction. So I think it's gone even further past curatorship, and it's become a very homogenized, and I'm not just speaking about orchestras, but classical music in general has become more homogenized over time. And I think this is going to be what is sort of the end of classical music as we know it, because why would you go hear any particular orchestra or group if they all sound the same?
I want to come back to the end of classical music as we know it, because I want to just kind of trace a little bit of history more, and then we will circle back for sure to this topic. But it sounds like when you were at Juilliard, you were looking to actually create an artistic voice for yourself on the trumpet, and that's why you had the idea to put together this brass quintet, Meridian Arts Ensemble. Is that correct?
Yes, and actually that came from when I was in high school. I used to go hear the Empire Brass Quintet a lot. And when I used to go hear them as a high school student, they were playing contemporary music. They played the Alvin Etler Brass Quintet, Peter Maxwell Davies. They commissioned Earl Kim, who was a composer in Boston. I think he was at Harvard at the time. They commissioned him. They commissioned Ira Taxon, a New York composer. And it was thrilling to go hear them. They would give these concerts at the Morse Auditorium near Boston University, and it was packed. And every brass student in Boston would be there high school and college and professionals, because what they did was, it was shocking, the sounds that they made. And then they left the symphony. They became a full-time touring group.
So to clarify, they were members of the Boston Symphony.
Yeah, a couple of them were members of the Boston Symphony, and they left to go full-time with the group. But then the repertoire changed. It did an about face. It became commercial because they had to appeal to all kinds of audiences, not just a sophisticated audience in a major metropolitan area.
They had to put together national and international tours and actually get an audience.
Right. And they were doing, I don't know, Rolf told me once they were doing like over 200 concerts a year. I mean, it was.
That's Rolf Smedvig, who played first trumpet in the group. Did
Yes.
he have an artistic voice, would you say, on the trumpet?
Yeah, I think so. Actually, I mean, I thought it was very artistic what they were doing. They were curating, but they were also generating new music. And that was very interesting to me, to go hear music that didn't sound like anything I'd ever heard before. So they had, you know, moved on to their touring life and the repertoire change. And so after sort of suffering through a couple of years in college and trying to think about what I was going to do, I realized that there was a void in the brass chamber music world that was not being filled. There were a lot of brass quintets, but there were only one or two that were really doing music that seemed like it was current, you know, living composers. Being of the generation that I was, growing up in the 70s, listening to the radio, watching television, you know, things like Tom and Jerry and these television shows where they would hire live bands to make the soundtracks. I got exposed to a lot of that, you know, jazz commercial influence music. And so with Meridian, it was sort of, yeah, let's explore some current music of living composers, but try to, you know, what's our take on it? Our generation, right? We didn't grow up in the 50s or the 60s. We were listening to the radio in the 70s. So I think what we did reflected that. And the composers that we worked with reflected that also.
I like to tell my students that every group needs a Jon Nelson. And what I mean by that, now we have the real thing with us. And what I mean by that is that you, at the end of rehearsal, you would say, when are our next 5 rehearsals? What are we going to record on our next CD? Who should we commission? Who are you going to call to try to get a concert lined up? Who are you going to call? You were full of energy, organization. You disparage your studently abilities when you were in school, but in fact, you were incredibly organized and full of structure for the group, and the group really prospered because of the energy you provided. So where does that come from? How'd you do that? How can people learn to do that? And so on.
Well, I think when we certainly, for a long time, you guys were all quite busy doing gigs, and everybody was quite content doing gigs. I didn't have that many gigs. I had kind of some free time on my hands. Most of my gigs through college and after were church gigs, weddings on the weekends, and Latin gigs. So my week was pretty free. But, you know, Friday, Saturday night, I'd beat my face up with merengue or salsa jobs. And then Saturday, Sunday, I'd beat my face up playing the piccolo trumpet in Long Island or, you know, Queens. And that's what I did. And I just, you know, it wasn't really enough for me. I figured, well, I came to New York, I went to college, I suffered through all of this. I got to do something. So it was just that, you know, I had time. In New York, you know, there are lots of great players. And I guess my philosophy was, well, as you know, people came and went from the group. And my feeling was, well, if you want to come on the ride, let's do it. If you don't want to be on the ride, you can go. We'll get somebody else. And we always did. You know, I remember the personnel changes always seemed to occur in some vacuum of crisis. And it always seemed like, oh, geez, what are we going to do now? But we always worked it out. We always got somebody better. It was never a matter of finding great players. It was finding somebody who could fit the chemistry of the group. So,
well, I feel that if you listen to some of our recordings with different other trumpet players besides you, there's a different voice there depending on who was playing at the time. But it was always an artistic product. I felt like we were always creating something interesting and new, and were faithful to it. And I remember when we started playing Latin music with Revoltillo, and I didn't know how to do that. And you and Ben had to teach me how to do that, because you guys played Latin gigs with Chu Melendez and other people, and you learned how to play that style. And I looked at this music and I said, what is this? I don't even understand my rhythm or what I'm supposed to do. And so you were able to teach me how to do that, which was great. But through all of that, we were all exploring together.
right. And I think, so for us, it was like we were straddling two sides of the coin, in that we were curating, but we were creating repertoire that was written for us. So there was often a collaborative process with the composer. Sometimes there was very little collaborative process with the composer, like Milton Babbitt. You know, he just wrote what he was going to write. But he heard us play enough times that was our collaboration, that he came to hear us play, he knew what we did, and he wrote the piece. Other people like Kirk Newrock, Norman Yamada, some of those composers. Yeah, we worked with them. John Halley, they would come to rehearsals, we'd try things. But I think it was, you know, we were curating, but I guess we were curating music that was written for us.
And then you started arranging the music of Frank Zappa, and people who know the group often know it for the 4 different Zappa sets that we ended up putting out on CD and performing all over the world. What got you into Frank Zappa's music, and tell some of those stories?
A friend of mine, Michael Bernstein, nephew of the late Leonard Bernstein, the conductor, gave me a cassette of the 1988 band. And he popped it in the mail. He was living in DC at the time, with a note. He said, I think this would be really great stuff for your group.
That was Zappa's final band before.
That was it was called Make a Jazz Noise Here, was the album that music was from. And so actually we were driving up. I remember Wayne was with us, Wayne Dumaine. I think we might have been in 2 cars, but I remember we're driving up to Vermont or something, and it was very foggy. We drove up, we played a job, and then we came home. But we listened to that cassette in the car the whole way. And everybody in the car was just flabbergasted by the compositions and how the band was playing. So I just, you know, again, I had some time on my hands, and I sat down with a pot of coffee and some staff paper and pencils and started transcribing some of those pieces. And as I transcribed, I realized that they would work really well for a 5-part group.
So by transcribe, again, for non-musicians, what you mean is you're just writing down the notes that were played and sung by the band, the original band, which was not a 5-part band at all. I mean, there were, 13, 14, 15, 16 players in that band. Mm-hmm. But you were trying to take down very faithfully exactly what they were playing.
Yes, it was a process of reduction. And I had done that exercise. I never took any arranging or composition classes, but prior to that, I got a cassette of an album called The Gil Evans Orchestra Plays the Music of Jimi Hendrix. And I was totally into Hendrix when I was in high school. And so I knew these pieces that were on the Gil Evans album. And it was fascinating what he was doing with them. And actually some of the band members also made arrangements. So what I did was I started transcribing those pieces from the cassette, not with any intention of playing them, but I was just very curious about the orchestrations. So I'd make like an instrument inventory. I'd listen to the piece and write down every instrument I heard. And it was not traditional big band. There were timpani, there's alto flute, there would be 2 bass clarinets, there'd be tuba, French horn. Peter Gordon is on that. So that was kind of...
And just to jump in for 1 second, for people who are wondering why you didn't just look up online who played in those bands, I will point out this was in the 80s and there was no such thing as online. There were no, the internet had not
Right.
to be yet.
Right, and I think we had to do more research in those days, and I think that was a good thing. You couldn't get any Zappa music. There was none. There were no PDFs.
Printed music.
No printed music. The only thing that was floating around was a copy of his percussion piece called The Black Page, but it was not correct. So people just had to transcribe, and there were a few people who were transcribing his music, you know.
So you ended up, I think you transcribed and then arranged Tamershi Douine and Dupree's Paradise,
Mm-hmm.
2 Zappa tunes. I think that's what we started with.
Yep.
And we started playing those pieces. And we had added a drummer by that point, as I remember, because we had already decided we were going to play some jazz and some rock and some Latin music. And we wanted to sound authentic in every style that we attempted, and therefore had to have drums in order to properly play that music. First of all, why those 2 tunes?
Those were just 2 tunes that really jumped out at me on the cassette. But there were a lot of pieces on that cassette that Michael gave me, and I ended up mowing through a lot of that repertoire. A lot of the pieces that were on that first cassette were pieces that we did. The drum thing actually sort of grew out of, I think Ben and I were riding, Ben Harrington, the trombonist in Meridian, we were riding the subway and we were singing riffs from the Alvin Etler Brass Quintet. But we were putting in like imaginary drum parts around it. And if you look at that piece, the first movement is kind of like a slow funk tune. And I actually had written sketches of a drum part for the first and fourth movements of that piece. And we were talking about, I don't know if you remember, we were talking about playing the Etler with drums, playing the slow movement like with brushes, you know. And it was, you know, it was such a weird idea. But then I thought, well, why don't we just find something that works with drums independently, you know, rather than do the Etler with the drum set. But it kind of grew out of that music spoke to me in a very rhythmic manner. And it sounded like a big band without the drums. So that's kind of where the drums thing came from. So
we were playing a lot of concerts, and we were getting tape recordings because the technology was still at that point of little cassette tapes at that point. And so we would play a concert and tape it and bring the tape back. And you started sending those tapes to Frank Zappa.
Yeah, so I
had his address.
Well, I don't think I actually had his address. You know, when we were getting started, we were all about getting with the composer. And it didn't matter who it was. A lot of the composers we worked with in the early days were young and unknown, and it was very easy to call them up or, go knock on their door somewhere in New York City. But I wanted to get in touch with Frank. I just wanted to see what he thought. Like if we could get his input, then maybe would be, be a good thing. So I had a couple of people that claimed they could get a package to him, and I gave them a package and they sent it allegedly and never heard anything. And then I was wandering around the 5th floor at Juilliard, and the school was on break. It was in December. It was like a couple of weeks before Christmas. I don't remember why I was up there. Then I'm walking around and I bumped into Milton Babbitt. And he said, "How are you, my boy?" And I said, "Well, I'm okay. I'm a little stuck right now." And he said, "Well, what's the problem?" And I told him, "Well, we're trying to get in touch with Frank Zappa. We made this cassette. So-and-so said he could get it to him. Nothing's happened, blah, 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 blah." And Milton just listened. And then he said, "Okay, let me make a call." And then we said, "Okay, great. Thank you. See you." I never expected anything to come of that. 3 weeks later, on New Year's Day, Frank Zappa called me at home. So
What year is this? Do you remember? Early 90s?
91, I think. So Milton totally made the call. Milton Babbitt totally hooked us up with Frank Zappa. He probably called, I don't remember the gentleman's name, was the executor of the Edgard Varese estate, who was in California. And then that person called Frank or something, but I'm sure Milton called up Frank. Frank's going to pick up the phone for Milton Babbitt and vice versa. And Milton probably said, there's these kids, they're trying to reach you, give a listen. So they found the package. It was there at Frank's office, and he listened to it.
And just so people understand, Milton Babbitt, probably one of the most preeminent modernist 12-tone serialist composers, of the last century. And Frank Zappa, long-haired hippie guitar hero, prog rock star. It's an unlikely pairing, to say the least.
Unlikely, but somewhat. Milton was really the first, and he was the first American composer to put Schoenberg's 12-tone system into play with a direct connection to American jazz. Milton was a jazz clarinetist as a young man in Jackson, Mississippi. And there's a very nice documentary about Milton, and there are a few spots where he's playing the piano, and it's lovely, old tunes from the 20s, and it's lovely piano playing. I mean, he was like a jazz musician, really. He could have been. So I think on the surface, the connection is, somewhat mysterious, but they were both pretty serious musicians, and they both were not from any particular canon. They both created their own genre of music, and they both took a lot of heat for that. I think Frank was able to make a living at it because of, doing popular music. Excuse me. And Milton didn't, but my goodness.
Well, Milton was able to make a living because of academia.
Right, exactly.
So you found yourself talking on the phone with Frank Zappa, and I know that was a thrilling moment, and we ended up meeting with him and recording a lot of his music, which was, I think, it was exciting for us artistically because it totally expanded our role as, not as curators, but as making something new. Brass quintets had not played this kind of music before.
I think a lot of our colleagues in the brass world misunderstood what we were doing. They thought it was a sellout, that we were going commercial. like, oh, now they're playing Zappa. Like, oh, they're not really about contemporary music anymore. But what Frank told us was, I remember when we left his house that first time that we played for him, he told me, I like that you play my music in the context of other composers. And that was what he wanted. He was a chamber music composer as a youngster. And I think that really kind of stayed with him. And he liked being on a program with Stravinsky, Babbitt, Gesualdo. He liked the Ira Taxon piece a lot, he told me. He said it's the best brass piece he'd ever heard in his life. That's saying a lot. Probably because it sounded like Varese to him, There's a lot of very Varesian moments in that piece. So, yeah, I think we were misunderstood. People would make comments to me like, oh, you're doing Zappa now. Like, oh, It's like, well, you just don't get it, I guess. You're totally missing the point that we're putting him on the same program with Milton Babbitt counterparts, which no other American brass quintet dared to play. The only other group that played that piece, to my knowledge, was the Ensemble Intercontemporain Brass Quintet in Paris when Pierre Boulez was there, and they did it with a conductor. And we did it with no conductor. So you have to play those two composers on the same show, especially since Milton made the call,
Yeah, that's a wonderful tribute, and it expresses such a range of musical mind and heart to put those two composers together.
We played in Holland, I remember once. It was a club. I think it was like a hashish bar. And I remember we played the Babbitt, the counterparts, and people loved it. And then we played Zappa after that. They might have even come to hear the Zappa. But we played that piece and people were, shocked.
I remember in the 90s, it was always possible to recognize the Zappa fans who had come to our concert to hear the Zappa set, which was always at the end. And those were some of the most open-minded listeners that we encountered.
Right.
Which was really cool.
His fans were pretty open-minded, he spanned a lot of different genres of music in his concerts.
So let's jump to talk a little bit about the present and the future. Right now, there's no operas, there's no symphonies, except of course what's been recorded and cataloged. There's no chamber music concerts except when they happen on somebody's front porch or at a time of grave uncertainty. And this happens when classical music, whatever that means, is also at a time of grave uncertainty, just aside from the COVID pandemic. Can symphony orchestras survive? Can they survive in the number that there are currently or were last year? Can we continue to have opera? What's the future of our version of, if you want to call it classical or serious art music, American serious art music, European serious art music? Where's it going? Do you have any thoughts on that? I know it's a very small topic.
I think the United States is a very different animal from Europe. In Europe, classical music is indigenous to the culture, right? You can go to Beethoven's house. You can go to Schubert's house. Everybody in France knows who Debussy and Ravel were, and they knew who Pierre Boulez was.
You can ask a cab driver in Milan what's playing at La Scala.
Exactly. Classical music was brought to this continent to North America by refugees and the wealthy class. And when the wealthy class got here, they wanted to hear the music of their homeland. So they started orchestras with their money. Maybe some of them played. And then with World War I and World War II and the time in between, a lot of Europeans came to the States to get away from all the craziness over there. So you had Toscanini leaving fascism to come conduct the New York Philharmonic and then the NBC Orchestra. A lot of the musicians in the orchestras were Europeans. Boston Symphony had a lot of French musicians, a lot of German musicians. Very few, first generation Americans. So it was an imported culture. And I think because it was, there was it was highly sexist and racially biased. These orchestras were populated by white males. It was expensive to go to these concerts. So it was not something that was accessible to the general public. It was elitist because the people that were funding this were elitists and robber barons. Everybody thinks Carnegie Hall is amazing. It is, but Andrew Carnegie was a horrible person. The Ford Foundation does some wonderful things, but Henry Ford was a horrible person. He shot striking workers in front of the factory and was sending money over to help Hitler get going. That's where Henry Ford's coming from, So that money was what supported classical music. Now, the orchestras are big. They play 4 concerts a week, a lot of them. They have bloated administrations. The salaries are high. And I think it's been coming, but COVID is kind of a tipping point that when it comes back, if it comes back, I would predict the orchestras will be smaller. There will be lower salaries. There'll be smaller administrations. They might go back to 2 concerts a week, which is in the 60s, Boston Symphony played 2 concerts a week. They played like a Thursday concert and a Saturday concert, or a Friday concert and a Sunday afternoon concert. The orchestras did not pay a living wage, really up until, the mid-60s, depending on what city you lived in. So the musicians had to do other things. They had to be available for recording dates. They did chamber music. They composed. They wrote method books. They taught. They gave recitals. They played chamber music. Now, right up until COVID, it's very difficult for an orchestral musician to do any of those things because they've got a full week of rehearsals and then 3 or 4 concerts. It's too much. It's too much of one thing. So I think it's going to go back to kind of the way it was, where they're not going to be as busy. And maybe that will turn into, those musicians going out and diversifying their performing portfolio, But what do I know? I don't really know.
Well, we can speculate. It's an interesting time to speculate because of, 2 years ago, we wouldn't be having this conversation. We'd say, well, maybe there will be a change in the future. But now we can almost reach out and touch the change. And it makes it a very interesting time to speculate. I think that the orchestral repertoire, and you talked about this at the beginning of our conversation 45 minutes ago, is unbelievable. The symphonies of Mahler and Tchaikovsky and Brahms and Beethoven and Mozart, the operas that the great composers wrote. I mean, this is incredible music, and we don't want to lose it, for sure. At the same time, the business model in America is that symphony orchestras should be businesses that support themselves, and that's difficult. Europe has a different model, although that's changing as well. But I think we can agree that there will always be music. And if there's always going to be music, there's always going to be art music of some kind. But yeah, it's fascinating to think where it might go because we get so used to our present reality that it seems like it couldn't change. And one of the reasons the pandemic is so shattering is that it has changed what we never thought could change, which is our regular daily life.
Right. All those people with orchestra jobs thought they were set for life. You know, it's crazy. So maybe there's an opening for, you know, rethinking all of this. I've always thought that there was a case for chamber music in that it's leaner, it's more direct, it can be more relevant. And I think I'm a big believer in cultural relevance. You know, when we would ask a composer to write a piece for us in the group, one of our criteria was, well, you know, who is this person? What is he or she doing? And what kind of statement are they going to make with the piece? And not for it to just sound like another piece of contemporary music, because we got file cabinets full of that stuff.
But again, looking for a voice, a musical voice.
Right. And and a musical voice that is somehow going to communicate something on a social level to the audience, right? If you listen to, I was listening to the other day, there are these recordings now of the New York Philharmonic from the 1950s with Dmitri Mitropoulos conducting live concerts in Carnegie Hall. He was a big Mahler conductor and Strauss. Well, his Mahler symphonies and their live concerts, so there are mistakes. They're unbelievable. It sounds like those musicians are playing for their lives. There very well could have been musicians in that orchestra in 1951 that played in that orchestra when Mahler was conducting. It's likely. If not, there are people in that orchestra that knew people that were in the orchestra when Mahler conducted. So it was relevant.
Studied with those people who played in the orchestra.
Max Schlossberg was the great trumpet teacher that was hired to play in the New York Philharmonic when Mahler conducted, and he taught everybody. So, you know, Mahler, it's wonderful music, and I think in the 50s, yeah, it was relevant. Now, it doesn't seem so relevant.
And yet, when you're sitting listening to Mahler's Third Symphony, it feels very present, very relevant, full of emotion, and tangibly beautiful.
It depends who's playing it. I'd much rather listen to the 1951 recording with the mistakes and it's a little loose than a recording that was made 10 years ago. Because in 51, they did it in one take. It's a concert recording. You know?
So you and I are university professors. You teach the trumpet, I teach the horn, we teach some other stuff too. And we are mentors to our students. How can we change? What can we do to help our students prepare for a new world?
I've been preparing my students for the new world since I got here, or the alternative world, which is to identify what you would like to do with your life. That's the first thing. Maybe it's music, maybe it's engineering, maybe it's medicine, maybe it's math, whatever, right? Think about what you want to do and make sure you like it, because if you get a job in it, you very well might have to do it for the rest of your life. So make sure you like it.
So make a plan, step one.
Step one, make a plan. Step two, how does music fit into that? You don't have to be a professional musician earning money to be a great musician. You can be a fabulous musician and do it for a purely artistic motivation. Once you introduce the economic factor, that changes everything. You're going to have to go do a gig that maybe you don't really want to do. You might have to play with people that you're really not crazy about playing with. But if you do it for your own cultural enrichment, you can do it on your own terms. And I think that's a more artistic point of view more artistic way of looking at it than just saying, I'm going to be a music performance major, and then when I get out with my degree, I'm going to hope for the best. I don't think that's a very smart strategy. You're not doing anybody any favors. There are enough unemployed musicians walking around on public assistance of some kind, either their parents, government, you know, TA ships, whatever. That's all just buying time. But I have friends here I have a friend who's a museum curator, fabulous jazz drummer and composer, amazing. I have a friend who's an attorney who is an incredible pianist, sings, writes his own stuff. He's got a band, and the other members of the band are, there's a judge, a clerk for a judge, and then another attorney, 2 guitar players and a bass player. And they go out, they're gigging like before COVID, 3, 4, 5 times a week. And they sound great. And they rehearse a lot. And they don't have to take, you know, some nonsense thing, you know. So
The contractor who renovated our house is a wonderful French horn player, and he works around Madison quite a bit. And he also renovates houses and is a carpenter. So yeah, it is certainly possible to have a dual career.
I think it's important for students to consider, if you're going to do music, you're doing it because the music is telling you you have to do it. Number one, you don't choose it, it chooses you. The second thing is you have to consider a secondary income stream. Don't try to live on one thing only. Look at all the orchestra musicians that are out of work right now. I mean, they don't have time to pursue another income stream. If they're rehearsing 5 days a week and giving 4 concerts a week, and then you have to practice. You still have to practice to make sure you sound great when you get to the rehearsal or the concert. So I think for students now, be diverse and think about, you know, what's it going to be? You still want to do music? You got to do it. You can still practice, be a great musician. That work ethic is going to inform and carry into other things you do, like your home renovating horn player is a perfect example. He's probably really good at both things too.
He is.
So that means he would be good at whatever he's going to do.
So I assume that your step one then was, let's see, what did we say step one was? Step two was figure out where music fits in. Step one, make a plan. What do you want to do with your life? Step two, figure out how music is going to fit into your life. And then step three is that thing that I asked you about early on in our conversation, which is get off your butt and start doing stuff, practice, and go to law school and do gigs on Saturday nights and create a funk band or a brass quintet or a string quartet. But don't sit around.
Right. Well, I see with students now that, you know, you commented that we couldn't just go on the internet and see who was playing in the Gil Evans band in 1972 because there was no internet. Now, everything is available through an app and the touch of a finger. Yet, I don't think young people are as prepared as they could be. Because just because it's there in your hard drive doesn't mean you're working on it. Doesn't mean you're studying it. Doesn't mean you're listening to it. And I think that's, you know, that's the danger of all this technology. Also, we have a lot of distractions. Let's face it. We live in a horribly distracting environment right now. I think COVID has actually helped that in a way that people have been able to reduce their distractions. I know I'm practicing more. You know, I'm practicing a lot more than I did before COVID.
But ironically, there's probably many students, brass students, who, if they've gotten to this point in our conversation, have killed a good hour when they could have been practicing, because there's things like this available
Right.
online.
So you should turn this interview off and go practice then.
Yes, that's to the students and to me and
And to
Tom.
you. And I'm going to do it as soon as the Novocaine wears off from my root canal.
Thank you so much for speaking with me today on a difficult day.
Thank you, Dan.